Highways and byways crisscross America, cutting through deserts, mountains, and small towns. For most, they're just stretches of road, but for truckers, they are lifelines. They also hide secrets and sometimes horrors that remain unseen by the casual traveler. This is one such story, buried in the vast, silent expanse of the Mojave Desert. Tom Reynolds had been a trucker for nearly 15 years. The life suited him. He enjoyed the solitude, the hum of the engine beneath him, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out before him. It was 2017, and he was driving an overnight haul through the Mojave Desert, headed from California to Arizona. The desert was a vast expanse of pitch-black darkness, and Tom's dim headlights barely cut through it. Tom had been putting off getting his headlights fixed for weeks. Usually, it wasn't a problem, but tonight, with no other cars on the road and the desert enveloping him in darkness, it was different. He found himself squinting into the inky blackness, trying to make out the faint lines of the highway. As the hours dragged on, Tom began to feel the fatigue setting in. The endless stretch of road, the darkness, and the monotonous hum of the truck were taking their toll. He debated pulling over until sunrise, but pressed on, desperate to make his delivery on time. He needed the money, and time was not on his side. It was around an hour before dawn when Tom saw something fast approaching in the distance. The faint light of the approaching object seemed out of place in the otherwise dark expanse. As it drew closer, Tom's heart began to race. He slammed on his brakes, and his truck screeched to a halt just inches from a car parked in the middle of the road with its hazards on. The car was a new-looking red Ford Fusion, sitting squarely on the double yellow lines. The passenger door was wide open. Tom, curious rather than scared, stepped out to investigate. The warm desert air was still, and the only sound was the faint clicking of the car's hazard lights. Tom approached the car cautiously. The headlights of his truck cast long, eerie shadows, making the scene even more surreal. He peered into the car, expecting to find someone needing help, but it was empty. The driver's seat was vacant, and there was no sign of life. The sense of unease settled over him like a heavy blanket. Tom walked around the car, checking the back seat and the trunk. The trunk was locked, but he noticed a rope tied around it. The car's key was in the ignition, but the engine was off. Tom reached into the car and turned the key, but the trunk still wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the inside somehow. As he stood there, the desert around him seemed to grow even quieter. The silence was oppressive, and Tom found himself glancing over his shoulder, feeling exposed and vulnerable. He decided to investigate the trunk further, hoping to find some clue as to what was going on. He opened the back door and crawled into the back seat, reaching for the trunk. To his surprise, it finally gave way. Inside, he found 3 squished garbage bags and a length of rope. He was about to reach for one of the bags when the loudest gunshot he had ever heard rang out, shattering the silence. Tom slammed his head on the roof of the car in shock. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to get out of the car. As he climbed out, he heard a gruff voice yelling in the distance. The voice was getting closer, and Tom's sense of unease turned to outright fear. He saw a short, husky man with red hair standing by the trunk, holding a rifle and a shovel. They locked eyes for a moment, and Tom felt a chill run down his spine. The man had a worried look on his face, but there was something menacing about him. The man dropped his shovel and waved frantically, shouting for Tom to wait. Terrified, Tom jumped back into his truck and started the engine. He threw it into gear, his hands shaking, and sped off. The man's car chased him, its headlights looming in his rearview mirror. Tom's heart raced as he pushed the truck to its limits. The car behind him honked its horn and flashed its lights, but Tom didn't dare slow down. He kept glancing in the mirror, the man's car tailing him closely. He fumbled for his phone and called the police, trying to explain what had happened as best as he could. The dispatcher told him to keep driving and that they would send a patrol car to intercept the man. Minutes felt like hours as Tom drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The car behind him kept pace, its headlights glaring in his mirrors. Just when Tom thought he couldn't take it any longer, he saw the flashing lights of a police car up ahead. The man's car veered off the road and disappeared into the desert as the police car approached. Tom pulled over, shaking with relief. The officer approached his truck, and Tom frantically explained what had happened. The officer took down Tom's statement and assured him that they would search for the man. Tom watched as the police car disappeared into the desert, the adrenaline slowly leaving his body. He was safe, but the encounter had left him shaken. Tom completed his delivery in Arizona, but the events of that night stayed with him. He couldn't shake the image of the red-haired man and the eerie silence of the desert. He found himself avoiding nighttime drives through the Mojave, the memory of that night lingering in the back of his mind. He tried to rationalize what had happened, telling himself that the man was probably just burying an animal or something equally innocent. But deep down, Tom knew that there was something more sinister about that night. A few weeks later, Tom received a call from the police. They had found the red-haired man's car abandoned in the desert, but there was no sign of the man himself. The trunk had been emptied, and the garbage bags were gone. The police had no leads, and the case was left open. Tom was frustrated but not surprised. The desert had a way of swallowing secrets, leaving only whispers in the wind. Despite his fear, Tom found himself drawn back to the desert. He needed closure, a way to put the events of that night behind him. He returned to the spot where he had encountered the red Ford Fusion, hoping to find some clue that had been missed. The desert was just as silent and still as he remembered. Tom walked around the area, his footsteps crunching on the dry ground. He found nothing, no trace of the car or the red-haired man. As he stood there, he heard the faint clicking of hazard lights. He turned, and there, in the distance, was the red Ford Fusion, its passenger door wide open. Tom's heart raced as he approached the car, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The car was empty, just as it had been before. But this time, Tom noticed something he had missed. There was a note on the dashboard, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Stay away." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. He backed away from the car, his mind racing. The red-haired man was out there somewhere, and he didn't want Tom coming back. Tom got into his truck and drove away, the desert stretching out before him. He knew he would never have all the answers, but he had enough. The Mojave held its secrets, and some were best left buried. As the years passed, Tom shared his story with other truckers. It became a legend, a cautionary tale told around truck stops and campfires. The story of the red-haired man and the abandoned car became part of the desert's lore. Tom continued to drive, but he never forgot that night. The desert had shown him its darker side, and he knew that he had been lucky to escape with his life. One night, years later, Tom found himself driving through the Mojave again. The headlights of his new truck cut through the darkness, and the memories of that night came flooding back. He saw a car up ahead, its hazards flashing. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he pushed on. He had learned his lesson. The desert was a place of shadows and whispers, and some stories were best left untold. As he drove away, the car faded into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. Tom felt a sense of peace. He had faced the desert's haunting, and he had survived. The road stretched out before him, an endless ribbon of possibilities. Thank you for watching and for your continued support.